This is the first woman to ever win a gold medal in the Winter Olympics, and she did so in a year where only 11 women were permitted to compete. Welcome back to Olympic Winter is Coming, the series where, between now and the Winter Olympics starting in February, I'm taking you through everything you need to know to get started watching the Games. And today we're talking a little bit about the history of women in these Winter Olympic Games and how representation has changed massively since then. While the Summer Olympics actually started back in 1896, the Winter Olympic Games didn't start until 1924. At those first Games, there were only 9 different sports that were being competed in. But of all of those sports, women were only permitted to compete in exactly one of them. And that is one of the most popular sports we still have today, figure skating. While the 1924 Games were much smaller than the Games that we'll have in 2026, there were about 250 athletes representing 16 different countries. But only 11 of those athletes were women, and they competed in 2 separate events. Those were the women's individual event as well as mixed pairs. And figure skating back then looked incredibly different than what we're used to now. Herma Sabo, the Austrian figure skater who ultimately took the very first gold medal for women in figure skating, competed in a long black dress with very graceful and skillful moves. And Herma started skating with her mother at just 2 years old. And from there, she went on to be one of the most dominant skaters that we've ever had in figure skating history. By the time she came to the very first Winter Olympic Games in 1924, she had already won world titles, and she ultimately ended up going undefeated from 1922 to 1926. She's actually one of 4 women in the history of figure skating to have 5 world titles. And after the Olympics, Herma actually went on to also compete in pair skating at the same time. She ultimately took 2 world titles in pair skating, and to this day, she remains the only woman in history to hold an individual and pairs world title at the same time. But Herma was even more than just an incredible athlete. She was also a trailblazer for what ultimately became big changes in the sport. Herma was one of the first women to ever compete in a skirt above the knee, and this was something she was heavily criticized about, but it wasn't a vanity thing. Shorter skirts allowed for more freedom of movement, which ultimately allowed for more athletic skating. Despite being one of the most dominant figure skaters in history, Herma never competed in a second Winter Olympics. She abruptly retired in 1927 after she lost her world title against Sonja Henie. That loss was in a very controversial decision after a judging panel from the same country declared Sonja the winner. Herma declared that this decision was incredibly unfair, and she completely withdrew from the sport after that. The 2026 Games will actually be the most gender-balanced Winter Olympic Games in history. Instead of just 11 women competing, the Games in February will have 47% of participating athletes being women. The 2026 Games will have 50 events for women specifically, and that's 4 more than we had in the last Winter Olympic Games in 2022. Of all of those events, I would argue that figure skating remains one of the most popular events in the Winter Olympics, and a lot of that started with Herma taking that very first individual gold medal in 1924. And of course, remember to drop any questions you have about the Winter Olympics in the comments down below so that I can include them in this series, and be sure to follow along for the rest of Olympic Winter is Coming so that you can be prepared for the 2026 Games.